My name is Jennifer Boldt, and I'm a research horticulturalist with the Agricultural Research Service, which is part of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I've based in Toledo, Ohio. Just as a little bit of background, I grew up in a greenhouse family in Florida. And then for graduate school, I moved up to Minnesota and tried out cold tolerance. And then I landed with USDA after my PhD, and I've been with USDA now for a little over 11 years. So today I have the pleasure of sharing some of the research that myself and other members of our ARS group have conducted on silicon. So we'll primarily look at the aspects of managing plant stress in ornamental crops. So why are we here today? And part of that is to be discussing aspects of why silicon might be important in ornamental production. As Sean mentioned, a lot of the initial research on the benefits of silicon were conducted on field crops in field soils, and there wasn't much attention paid to greenhouse crops until about 20 years ago or so. And then we've seen a slow and steady uptick in research looking at benefits of silicon and silicon applications. So part of the reason for this is twofold. One, we grow in soilless substrates, and that can be growing media with components such as peat moss, pine bark, coconut coir, perlite, and or wood fibers. And those materials are low in silicon. Alternatively, if you're growing in hydroponics, then there's also very little silicon available in the background levels. And then secondly, a lot of our greenhouses have some sort of irrigation cleaning systems. And so we have the ability to clean, filter, or sanitize our irrigation water. And that also can remove silicon from that. So collectively, both of those things restrict the silicon availability that we have in our production systems. There still are trace background levels that exist through the water supply, a little bit through the substrate components, but then also you can get some trace amounts through fertilizers or other chemicals applied. So how or why did our ARS lab start studying silicon? And the short answer is it started about 20 years ago. So it predates me, and then I've sort of picked up the torch and carried on since I started in 2013. And so some of that early research was looking at various aspects, and some of those included, one was just quantifying silicon accumulation in a number of ornamental crops to see are any of them low accumulators, moderate accumulators, or high accumulators, and trying to classify them into those various categories. And then my predecessor moved on to looking at comparing different methods for quantifying silicon concentrations in leaf tissue so that we could get a simple, easy to use, and accurate protocol for our lab. And then they've looked at quantifying how much background levels of silicon we'll see in water, so including tap water, well water, pond water, things of that nature. As I mentioned, we've been looking at how much background amounts of silicon are available in the substrates, and then different fertilizers and chemical products that are commonly used in the greenhouse. And then from there, the group transitioned to looking at the benefits of silicon and where its applicability might be best seen. And so they started with looking at the benefits of silicon for copper toxicity and powdery mildew. And then I've carried on a little bit of that research. And what are we doing today? We're continuing to look at what conditions are beneficial for having supplemental silicon provided. And then we've been evaluating different sources of silicon and application rates to try and develop some guidance that we can provide to growers. So now it's time for a poll question. So Mina's going to launch that.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Yes, so for all those who want to earn their credits, I'm going to launch the poll, but anybody can participate. I just have to find it. There it is. Okay, so you should see the poll question on your screen, and hopefully you can participate in it. Okay, I see responses coming in. What prompted you to supply silicon to your crops? And please select all that apply. And some of the responses are overall plant health, environmental stress tolerance, like temperature and nutrient stress, pest and disease tolerance. I don't know why, but someone told me it was probably a good idea. And then I don't apply supplemental silicon to my crops. I still have a few more coming in, so I will leave this on the screen for a few more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and then share the results. So Jennifer, I think you can see those results and everyone else can too. Looks like it's across the board, or maybe you have like top 4 answers.
Mhm.
Okay, so I will stop
All right.
sharing.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So Mohammed did a wonderful job this morning describing some of the potential benefits of silicon that we see in the crops. And, it's always a good idea to hear things multiple times. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but just kind of run down some of the um, the characteristics or traits that you might see. And those would include improved growth and yield, thicker and larger stems, a reduced incidence of lodging, and we defined that earlier, but that would be, it's primarily seen in grass or grain crops, where after you have high wind, if you don't have enough structural integrity to the plants, they will tip over, which can reduce yield in the fields. But then for us, if we're growing ornamental millet or some ornamental grasses, then it's hard to have good quality at retail if the plant isn't structurally sound. We can also see increased rates of photosynthesis in terms of flowering, larger flowers, earlier flowering, more flowers, reduced bract necrosis in petunias, or not petunias, sorry, poinsettias especially, as well as insect disease and stress tolerance. So it sounds like silicon's like this miracle thing. And so just the one word of caution on that is that, not every crop will exhibit all these responses, and not every crop will exhibit the same responses. But generally speaking, most crops will exhibit at least one positive response to supplemental silicon application. Um, and so here is a picture of 2 sunflowers. The one on the left has not had any supplemental silicon applied, and then the plant on the right has had supplemental silicon provided. And what I'd like to point out and highlight here is that the leaf angle is more horizontal in the plants that were receiving supplemental silicon, which then helps improve their ability to capture sunlight or capture supplemental lighting in the winter months. And then that can help then lead to improved growth. So one thing that I hear talking with growers, and that we have also seen in our research from time to time, is this statement that I added silicon, but it isn't doing anything, or I didn't see any effect of adding silicon. And I just wanted to address briefly why that might be the case. And so I want to use this picture here as an example. We did a study where we looked at supplying plants with different levels of phosphorus fertilization. And then we had plants also receive supplemental silicon or not receive supplemental silicon. And what I wanted to point out here is that we typically see a positive response to silicon when plants are stressed. So if we look at the lowest application rate of phosphorus, we see that providing supplemental silicon helped the plants to flower earlier and they were a little bit taller. Now, for greenhouse growers, taller sunflowers might not be the best, but if you are a cut flower grower and you want longer stems, then that might be a benefit. Um, However, when we start applying enough phosphorus for the plant to be growing healthily, then we didn't see a difference in terms of flower size or time to flower across the plants that had silicon and the plants that did not have silicon. So I just wanted to mention that we tend to see minimal response or even sometimes no response to silicon when the plants are growing under non-stressed conditions. So if they've got perfect temperature, perfect light levels, perfect fertilizer levels, that we may not see that benefit. And the reason why we may not see that benefit is because we suspect that there's enough trace amounts of silicon within your production systems that the plants have enough to continue on growing as normal. But when we start to experience drought stress and heat stress and other types of stress, then that's when we see the benefit or the most benefit of adding silicon. So I wanted to now transition into some of the research that we've looked at. And one area of interest was with unrooted cuttings for vegetative propagation. And so for anyone who's not familiar with that process, wanted to mention that the stock plant facilities for many of our ornamental crops are located outside of the US. Primarily for us, that's Central America and Mexico. And so then the cuttings are harvested, packaged, and then shipped to the US. And in an ideal world, it shows up about 48 hours later at the greenhouse. But however, if we have ice storms and winter storms like we're experiencing now, or delays at customs, then those cuttings in that box can experience high temperature swings, as well as a delay in when they get propagated. So we wondered if we supply the stock plants with silicon, could we help mitigate the stress experienced by the cuttings during that shipping process? So we grew 3 geranium cultivars in 8-inch pots, and then we irrigated those stock plants with or without silicon within the fertilizer solution. And then every 2 weeks, we harvested the cuttings and then looked at the cutting quality and then the propagation aspects of it. So first up, when we looked at the cutting quality at the harvest, we can see under the column that says cuttings per plant, we have the number of cuttings for the plants that didn't have any silicon, and then the plants that did receive silicon. So for example, if we look at Americana orchid, we see that the number of cuttings per plant is just a titch higher, but it's not significantly different from each other. So in terms of the productivity of the stock plants, we didn't see an increase in the number of cuttings that we could harvest off of those plants. We also didn't see a difference in the stem diameter of those cuttings that we harvested off of those stock plants. Again, we think that that's because the plants were grown under ideal conditions. So we said, that's interesting. But let's take a look at the post-harvest quality of the cuttings. So in terms of the post-harvest aspect, we took half of our cuttings and we immediately propagated them and put them in a growth chamber. And then the other half of the cuttings, we went through a simulated shipping process. So we placed the cuttings in plastic bags, we put them in a cardboard box, we drove them from the greenhouse back to our lab, which was about a 15-minute drive. And then we put them on a rotating shaker in the dark at 50 degrees for 3 days. And that was to simulate air transit and vehicular transit from Central America to the greenhouse. And then we propagated those plants, placed them in the same growth chamber with the non-shipped plants. And what did we see? So first, I'll point out, it's the laser pointer. So first I'll point out that anything that was blue, those were the plants that we immediately propagated. And then any of these bars that are orange were plants that went through simulated shipping. Then beneath, you'll see 3 different colors of the blue and 3 different colors of the orange. The different intensities of the coloration indicate each cultivar, and they're abbreviated below. And then beneath that is how much silicon they had. So we received no silicon, and then silicon, no silicon, then silicon, and so on. So the first thing is that if the cuttings were stuck immediately, we didn't see any difference between non-silicon treated and silicon treated plants in terms of their root rating. And their root rating was assessed on a 0 to 5 scale, with 0 being no visible roots after 3 weeks, 1 having just a couple roots, and then this was a 2, a 3, a 4, and a 5. So, as I mentioned, no effect when the cuttings were immediately harvested and propagated. Second thing to point out is that for each one of the cultivars, the plants experienced stress during that shipping process, and therefore all of our root ratings were lower in the simulated shipping cuttings versus the plants that were immediately propagated. And then lastly, we'll point out that when the plants went through simulated shipping, for all 3 of the cultivars, we saw that providing silicon had a higher root rating compared to the plants that didn't receive silicon. So we see this as a potential benefit for cutting propagation, that we could either have reduced losses during that shipping process and sticking process, or we might be able to then transplant those cuttings a day or 2 earlier because they're starting to root more quickly. The second study I wanted to mention was some of the research we've done looking at the impacts of silicon for reducing heavy metal toxicity. And primarily, I'll focus on copper toxicity today. And this is in collaboration with the University of Toledo. And for this study, we looked at growing plants without silicon, growing plants with silicon, growing plants without silicon but high levels of copper, and then growing plants with high levels of copper and the addition of silicon in their nutrient solution. These were grown hydroponically just for ease of harvesting the root tissue, because if you've ever tried, it takes a while to wash the roots completely clean from a peat-based substrate. So what did we see? We saw that when the plants had copper toxicity, they had a lower plant mass. But when the plants had that high level of copper, with the addition of silicon, they were able to grow much better than when they had high levels of copper. They didn't completely grow the same as non-copper stressed plants, but we did see that they significantly increased their yields when they had the addition of silicon when high levels of copper were supplied. And we saw the same both for the foliage as well as for the roots. So we can see here that when we had high levels of copper, we had low root weight, but then when we had high copper with the addition of silicon, that we had an increase in the root fresh weight. And then we said, well, how is the silicon providing a benefit? And what we saw is that when the plants were given just high copper alone, there was a lot of copper that was taken up into those roots. However, when we had high levels of copper and silicon supplied, that we had much lower amounts of copper in the roots. And so the silicon is helping to keep the plant from taking up quite as much copper, so it's not as toxic to the plant. And in addition, we see that when we had a stress, so we had copper plus silicon, we had an increase in the amount of silicon in the roots compared to when we gave the plants silicon, but not under stressed conditions. So we're trying to tease out the whole interplay of how the plants are using the silicon and signaling, but this is exciting for us. Briefly, I'll mention that other members in our group, the entomologists on my team, have also looked at the benefits of silicon against some insect pressures. And here's an example where we had plants, and the plants were either supplied silicon here in the black circles, or plants that didn't have silicon, and that's in the white circles. And in this case, for the plants that had silicon supplied, the aphids that were introduced to those plants had a lower amount of reproductivity. And then we've done some work looking at cold stress and chilling stress. And so this graph here is going to show that we grew plants at normal temperatures, and then we gave them 3 days of cold stress at 39 degrees, 43 degrees, and 46 degrees. And at the lowest temperature, we saw that the plants that had received silicon were less stressed than the plants that did not receive silicon. So we reduced the severity of the stress. And here's some pictures to show for tomato and for pepper. So the plants that didn't receive silicon were smaller and also had more leaf damage. And then this is another look at some of those plants. So when we had plants that were grown without silicon, and then plants that were provided silicon, when they got that chilling stress, the plants that had received silicon were less severely affected. And then just to finish up before Mina tells me I am out of time, is that we looked at some studies with powdery mildew. And Mohammed showed a very similar picture earlier this morning, and we saw that silicon supplementation can slow the progression of powdery mildew, but it doesn't eliminate it completely. So here's a graph that will show plants that received silicon and plants that did not receive silicon. And this is the percentage of the leaf area that's covered with powdery mildew. So you can see that when we gave the plant supplemental silicon, they still did get some outbreak of the powdery mildew, but it wasn't as severe. And then some more pictures to show for powdery mildew suppression in sunflowers. In this case, we applied potassium silicate as a drench. And these were plants that did not receive any potassium silicate. And we had about 4 leaves per plant that were affected with powdery mildew spores. Whereas if we provided silicon, then we had less than 1 leaf per plant that was impacted. So to wrap up, we see that there are background levels of silicon present in our greenhouse systems, and those may be sufficient if the plants are not under stressed conditions. So we were looking at supplemental silicon as an insurance policy to help alleviate any expected or unexpected stresses that may come along. And so with that, it's always great to acknowledge the team that makes all of this research happen so that I'm able to share it with you today. And thank you for your time.
Great presentation, Jennifer, really informative. You've done a lot of research using silicon. I know that there's a few questions in the Q&A. Do you want to explore that yourself, or do you want me to read the questions aloud?
Let's see. Let me see. There we go. Q&A. Okay. Do you want me to start with the one about perennials?
Sure, I think, yes, please. Yeah, we left that one for you.
Okay,
Yeah.
so do you know of any testing that has been done in regards to any specific perennials? I can only speak to our research in which we've looked at lilacs and phlox, verbena, and lantana. And in those cases, other than lantana, those other 3 crops, lilac, phlox, and verbena, the upright verbena, we saw benefits of silicon against powdery mildew. But we haven't done anything besides herbaceous perennials. So I should say we're not like looking at Muhammad and doing long-term studies with citrus crops or other things like that. But yes, we have looked at herbaceous perennials, and we also see benefits to them in terms of supplying silicon. All right, long question that I'll read out. We're located in Central Florida. Our primary crops are potted calla lily, poinsettia, mums, tropical foliage, and clematis. I'm interested in the drought tolerance / post-harvest potential for all of our flowering crops, as well as disease and pest resistance. Clematis wilt is a disease for which there are not currently any good chemical treatment options, so I would be interested in testing whether it could aid in disease resistance. So in short, I have not tested clematis wilt and the benefits of silicon for that, but I would say that it sounds like you are setting yourself up to do a little in-house trial. And if you have questions about Melanie, if you have questions about setting up an in-house trial, feel free to reach out to any of the speakers today, and we can chat with you about sources of silicon and rates to look at. Okay, next question. Like the copper toxicity study, have you looked at silicon in high salinity soils? Does silicon, questions moved. Hold on, let me scroll back up. Oh no, where did the,
It tends to move around if a question comes in.
I lost it. I'm
I know.
sorry.
Here, I'll
Oh,
find it for
I
you.
think it was salinity. I haven't specifically looked at salinity. I believe Mohammed did, and Neil might also speak to that next. Okay. Poinsettias sometimes require PGR to control plant height and stretch. If silicon increased height in sunflower, have the same height effects been seen in poinsettia? I haven't tested specifically with poinsettia, so I can't speak to that. But in other crops that we've studied, we have not seen an increase in height. So that might just be a sunflower specific response. Okay. Does silicone help with downy mildew prevention? We haven't tested downy mildew specifically. I believe Sean mentioned in his presentation the possibility for control against both downy and powdery mildew. So maybe Sean will be able to weigh in on that. Um,
I think we have time for just one more question.
One more. Okay. Jennifer's last point in her last slide seemed to implicate that you could add too much silicon. Could you put that slide back up or comment on it? So, yes, very short is I mentioned, so we haven't seen negative effects on the plants themselves if you get too much silicon in solution. More so what we see is if you try to supersaturate the soluble silicon in solution, if you're supplying it, say, as potassium silicate, and if you supersaturate it, then you tend to get precipitation of that silicon out, and it can precipitate with other things, or it can form amorphous silica, which then leads to there being less silicon available in solution for the plants to take up. So that's the logic behind that. So as long as the silicon is mixed in solution and not precipitating out, then it's available for the plant.